Hello there. We're coming to the end of 2024, so I thought I'd post a few videos in the last few days of the year, culminating in one on New Year's Day, January the 1st, and then from then on we'll be back to the normal routine of one video a week. And this time, these few, I thought, well, we've just had Christmas over here, I'm doing this day after Boxing Day, New Year coming, everybody's pretty much on holiday. It's a relaxing time of the year. I thought these would be a little bit more light-hearted than usual, less serious. We'll come back to next instalment of Conquered and the Proud. I think we'll start a couple of talks on Antony as a soldier and as a general. In January, I'll do something about Roman army bases. I've got an idea for maybe several, perhaps even a whole month of talks about Roman cavalry in different periods and how that worked and understanding that sort of thing. That'll come during the course of the year. We'll talk more about this in the last of these videos, the New Year's Day one, when we'll look at how the Romans began a political year under the Republic, and then after we've done some proper history we'll go on and just talk about what we're likely to be doing on the channel this time. But today I thought I'd follow up on one of the videos from the first Q&A session, which asked about my favourite historical novels. So instead of novels, I thought today we'd look at favourite historical films. Now, in my usual way, I had in mind, I could sit down, I could plan this out, I could check which year everyone was released and all this sort of thing and go through it and make sure that I didn't forget anything as I was going along. But, it's been Christmas and there's been a lot to do and, assembling toys, looking at Lego sets, all that sort of thing, supposedly for my son. More generally, so it's just been busy and I haven't had the time, and I thought, well, it'd be nice to have a few videos at the end of the year, so let's just chat. The idea with all these talks is that they should be fairly conversational. It's as if you're, well, as I think I joked at the start, as if you've got stuck beside me at a party or something like that, or on a train somewhere, and we've unfortunately begun a conversation and you can't shut me up. Obviously it's one-sided because that's the nature of being filmed, but we'll start having some conversational ones with guests as the year goes on. I should be able to sort that out soon, and that's something else that'll be new. But today it's historical films, and I'll be a little bit vague when it comes to film, because sometimes you think, well, something that's been made for TV but is film length, do we count that, do we not? I haven't established a hard and fast rule. That's Gussie starting to yell in the background. I'll open the door slightly so he can push his way in if he wants to, but I don't know quite what he wants at the moment. He's been fed, he's comfortable, he doesn't want to go out because it's raining, so I'm not quite sure. This might just be a pay attention to me. There we go, he's just wandered in, so I'm going to make an appearance. There we go, nearly fell off my chair. There we go. He's there. Gussie's perhaps his last appearance for 2024, but I'm sure he'll be there in the future, so for the cat lovers amongst you and the Gussie admirers, here is Augustus the cat. But I don't quite know what he wants. So anyway, but our theme is not cats, it is films. And as I did with the novels, I'll come close to choosing a favourite one for each period, but I'm not going to restrict it just to the ancient world. Let's go through and look at things I've liked from various periods of history. Be a mixture, the basis on which they get included. Right, do you want to go down? Okay, you go over there. Some of them because they're historically very good, they give a sense of a period, or perhaps even there's just a scene or two that's captured the imagination that you feel, oh, that's right, or it's just spectacular and good cinema. As I was thinking about it, an awful lot of the films I'm going to include are relatively old. They're ones that I probably saw on television while I was growing up and had an influence on me, helped to inspire me to want to read about a period or get more and more enthusiastic about the Romans in particular, history in general. So sometimes they're there because they've meant something to me. And there's a few I'll mention where, because I've seen them in the cinema when they've been re-released, that's had a particular impact. So let's start with the ancient world. Now obviously I've done videos on Spartacus already, Gladiator, we've been doing the Rome series, we've done Centurion, we've done a few films one time or another, and we're going to do more in detail. These, like talking about the novels, it's not going to be an in-detailed analysis of the history behind each film, but there will be films that we'll be coming on to do in the future. On the whole, I must confess, although I've done 300 Spartans and Alexander, I don't think any of the Greek set films quite make it to my sort of top few, let alone my main choice for the period. So there's aspects of those I rather like, but they don't quite work altogether. Spartacus is obviously up there. It's one of the first film videos I did, and again, this was re-released, I don't know whether it was late 90s or early 2000s, but I got to see this on the big screen. And that's quite something. You know, those epics really do stand out when you see them in that, you know, the grand sweep. You're there and in the darkness of a cinema. So that's one that's always been impressive, and the battle scene in particular I rather like. I'm fond of a lot of the old epics, but they can be a little bit ponderous. You know, they're obviously designed. This was going to be a long thing. Some of them had an interval in the middle, which, to be honest, it's probably my middle-aged inner workings coming to the point. I'd be quite grateful of that in some of the longer films these days. That, you know, like missing out, nipping out during a film and missing a vital scene or two. But sometimes I'm afraid nature makes this necessary. So a lot of the old epics can be a little bit slow. They've got some great set pieces, some great spectacles, but they're quite hard work to sit through in one go. And I don't always have the time these days to do that, or the inclination to sit down and relax and do that. I mean, it's quite nice when I've decided I'll do a video on something that, okay, I'll sit down and watch it. So, you know, we'll do Cleopatra at some point, the Burton and Taylor one. And that's got some magnificent scenes in it. But it does go on. You know, they've set themselves a big story, and that's fine. I like that sort of thing, but it can be hard work, and the pace is a little bit different. You have films like Ben-Hur, which has a couple of very memorable scenes, but it takes about 3 hours to include them. So you've got to mention the chariot race in Ben-Hur, and the old Charlton Heston one, not the recent remake, which I've not seen yet. At some point, I'll probably do a video not about Ben-Hur as a film altogether, but looking at the naval battle, the one against the pirates early on, and the chariot race, the two big set pieces that have a historical aspect to them, and in the one case a military aspect to them. We'll talk about how those are presented in the old silent version, the black and white one, which I've got on disc, but I don't think I've ever got around to watching, and the famous Charlton Heston one, and then that remake from a decade or so back. How they present things differently, how it works in each one. I thought that would be interesting, but I've got to sit down and watch all the different bits at some point. So that's on the list of things to do. But the chariot race is spectacular in the extreme. I mean, it doesn't reflect reality too well, in the sense that you wouldn't have too many chariot races where only about one chariot finishes and nearly everybody else is, you know, lying in ruin, and the charioteer is maimed or dead at the end of it. And there's that poor devil of a soldier, you know, Legionary Publius, that they've just stationed there because they've got them on the central spine of the arena, and one of them just gets run over by a racing chariot, and you're thinking, it's not a great job to pull, not a great duty. But it is marvellous. I mean, it's wonderful cinema, and that's something, I've never seen this on the big screen, but I'd like to, just because it's so good. And it helps me, you know, I've warmed a little bit to the Star Wars prequels in recent years, because watching them with a small boy, you realise that's the audience they're going for. But you know, the pod racing thing and the Phantom Menace is obviously drawn from this, and it makes me warm a little bit more to that film than I did when it first came out, and I was hoping to recapture my own childhood, and of course that sort of thing doesn't happen, because I'd seen the first Star Wars film when I was about 7 or 8 or something like that, and it was, you know, like nothing I'd seen before. So the Ben-Hur chariot race is wonderful. Get some points for that. The naval battle's quite good. You know, it's memorable, even if again it's wrong. You've got the oarsmen are all on the same level. They're all slaves. You wouldn't be in a warship in the Roman period. You know, you might, in some desperate cases, you're a former slave. And Sextus Pompey's fleet includes plenty of those, but you're not going to be chained to the oars. You're not going to be whipped. All this sort of thing. But the drum beats and the battle speed, ramming speed, and all this sort of, it's very great cinema. It's very powerful. Those images, those sounds, they stick in your mind. So great points for cinema, less so for the history. But again, we'll come on to the history behind the chariot race and the naval battle when we do our Ben-Hur special at some point during the year. So that's worth including. Of the more recent films, You've got, obviously, Centurion. I have a soft spot for. I've done the video on that, though it sort of doesn't quite work, but at least it's making an effort. The Eagle, we'll do a session on that, or we might do it joint with the BBC television series that inspired me very much when I was a kid, based on the same Rosemary Sutcliffe novel at some point. It's quite a nice battle scene, attack on the fort. The fort's, it's too small for an auxiliary fort, but it's for a whole cohort anyway, but it's quite nicely done. Again, whether it be timber at that period as well, this is supposed to be, you know, well into the 2nd century. By then, pretty much everything in Britain's been replaced in stone, so that doesn't quite work. But on the other hand, for an early turf and timber fort, although I think it's more earth, they haven't used the turf for the walls, so it does look different. But anyway, I've on this and on a few other things, we'll mention this again, I've got a video coming up. I did an interview with the folk from Invicta again, so there's the one up already about their take on Cannae and their computer modelling of it, but we've done another one on Roman frontiers and their presentation in films, particularly Hadrian's Wall, for them. So that's coming out sometime. I'm not sure when they'll release that. So again, when that's out, you can hear me talking about some of these aspects in a bit more detail. And at some point I will do again, we'll probably do a Hadrian's Wall month at some point, perhaps during this year, perhaps not, where we look at the history, we look at the presentation of it in different mediums as well. So that's, again, all to come. It's got good moments, but I always had this problem, even with the story, that the best stuff for me as a Roman army geek happens early on at the, you know, the beginning with the battle and the fight and all this sort of thing. It's a shame that the chariot that they turn up with looks like something that they would have imagined when the novel was written, or they did when the BBC did their dramatisation in the 70s. You know, it doesn't look like an Iron Age Celtic chariot, which is a shame. It would be nice to see those done properly. It's odd that in the very old epics you had a lot of chariots, and everybody Roman seems to drive a chariot all the time, but actual battlefield ones they don't really deal with. When you had the movie of Troy, you know, not too long ago, one of my disappointments with that was that there are a couple of chariots, but it isn't really chariot warfare, and our heroes jumping down, fighting, and then making a quick getaway, which would have been nice to see. I'd like to see a really good depiction of that sort of thing on screen, but then I'd like to see a really good depiction of Celtic, ancient British, that sort of style of fighting, the look of the warriors, the way of doing things. As yet, it hasn't happened. We'll see. I mean, there's talk of this Russell Crowe film, The Last Druid, or something, how that will deal with it. The danger is with anything that Hollywood touches is that they simply revive the old cliches, in a sense, the language, the vocabulary that people have got used to. You know, if we present somebody in animal skins with long hair and a beard, we know they're a barbarian. And chariot, well, it's got to be big and chunky and preferably have sides on the wheels and all this sort of thing, regardless of the history. But sometimes, you know, they make an effort and they get things, if not right, then moving in the right direction. So we'll see. It would be nice. You know, having written fiction on this with my Wendelander stories, it's made me think about how you present it, and it would be nice to see it done in a more realistic way, but who knows? It might happen, it might not. I have a consolation, at least if there's anything set in the ancient world, that's something. It helps to encourage interest, no matter how many liberties they take with the history. So of the recent ones, Gladiator, obviously, Gladiator 2 I've talked about not too long ago. Gladiator, of course, I got to see in the cinema when it came out. I was old enough to do that. It's a film with its great moments in it. I think for me, because I was already deeply obsessed with the Romans long before it came out, it didn't have that eureka moment that it clearly has for a lot of people. I've met plenty of people over the years said, oh, you know, I really got interested in the ancient world, in the Romans, in archaeology, and all of these things because I saw Gladiator, and I thought, what a great film. I loved it. And that's marvellous. To hear that sort of thing is always wonderful. So it has done an awful lot of good. And I think the sequel, even if it won't have quite the same impact because it's a sequel, might help in the same way. So I'm all for those, but I think I'll choose for my favourite a film that in many ways has lots of problems with it, and I think I'm choosing this on the basis of a few good scenes and a look. But it's also that I think it got me excited when I was young. You know, when you had mostly on, you'd get the biblical epics, which would have a few Roman soldiers in. Those are the bits I waited for, and very occasionally, you know, in the robe and things like that, there's a few small fight scenes, but there's not a lot to go on. And there's, I can't remember, is it King of Kings or one of them, where the Roman army is presented as this machine that just wipes out a group of rebels, probably led by Barabbas or somebody like that, to drum beats and music, basically, and they just sort of walk forward and slaughter everybody. I've spent most of my career arguing that Roman soldiers weren't machine-like automata of that sense, so that's something I've reacted against, but it's had an impact on me. But I think I will go for the Fall of the Roman Empire as my favourite, and that's something I will cover in a full-length video just on the history behind the film. And I sat down to watch some of this while I was wrapping birthday and Christmas presents just a week or so ago, and had a lot to do. And I usually sit down with the movie. Often it's the old 60s Battle of the Bulge, because it's fine as sort of background things, and again, it's something I saw as a child, so I have more fondness for than perhaps it deserves on its own merits. As something in the background while I'm doing all of this, and instead I couldn't find that, so I put on Fall of the Empire. I just like the look of some of it, particularly the earlier scenes on the northern frontier. And, you know, there's that grand set that I think at the time was one of the most expensive built in Europe and all this sort of thing. And the whole thing, like a lot of these epics, went horrendously over budget, didn't make its money back, all this sort of thing. It doesn't really look like a Roman army base, but it's got enough elements of it, and it's dramatic enough as a scene, and when you have all these tiers and people lined up parading at various ways, it's impressive. Alec Guinness is great in it. Christopher Plummer does a very good loopy emperor turn. So you've got Sophia Loren, so you can't argue with that. There's a lot that's fun about it, even if, as I say, it's a very ponderous story. With James Mason, of course, in there as the freedman. A lot of it doesn't make sense. It's stuff that's filtered through into Gladiator, and even more in Gladiator 2. I mean, somebody mentioned in the comments, I didn't put in the video because I thought it was a spoiler, that they now present the Lucius character as Maximus is Russell Crowe's son. The sort of hints of an affair, or at least, whether it be with Sophia Loren and Stephen Boyd's character, that filters into there were elements in the Gladiator script that clearly come from this film, as other bits come from Spartacus and elsewhere, all a bit jumbled and not quite logical in what's how you feel. There are these sort of, it's like something that hasn't quite been, the editors haven't picked up the changes, so you still get oddities from earlier drafts and things, which often happens. That's going on. I mean, the story's a bit loopy, though. It's nice you have at the end one of the senior officers starts auctioning the the empire off to the highest bidder, that sort of thing. This thing that happened after the murder of Pertinax. So it's fun, but what I like about it, and I think what's mattered to me, perhaps because of this Roman army, being one of my main interests, there's some very good battle scenes. I like the Roman columns marching into the forests, and the Germans waiting and coming out to ambush. And again, it's terribly stylized. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The idea, send these people miles away to get ambushed before you send the rescue force towards them. But the barbarians, they get away with looking suitably big and hairy and nasty. Again, it's not all that rigidly accurate, but it has nice moments, and it sort of does the Trajan's column thing. Some of the barbarians have got clubs and all this sort of thing, and they've got the Swabian hair, and it's as I say, there's something about that clicked with me and made me want to know more about the Roman army when I was quite young, and got me excited the next time it was on a few years later, and I knew a bit, thinking, oh, yeah, even though I was going into, by then, the geeky, well, that armour's not right, and those shields are really weird, and what's going on with this, and problems. Again, when I come to talk about how Roman commanders commanded in battle, which is something I'll do at some point, it's interesting how, again, you often get the Hollywood presentation of them here, where they just charge around hacking about them like ordinary soldiers, and don't really do any command aspects at all. There's also the very weird decimation scene that again, it struck me as interesting when I was a kid, because I'd heard of decimation, that they have these chaps lined up along the side of a bridge, and then he goes along counting, and when they get to number 10 they push this bloke off the bridge down into the the ravine below. So it's a ponderous film, it's heavy going, the story doesn't quite work, there's lots of duller bits in between the big set pieces, and the set pieces are grand but not always accurate, but there's something about it, I think, that has stuck with me. So even though weirdly I'm choosing something that I don't watch very often, I've probably sat down to watch Spartacus more often for pleasure, I think just this once it'll edge in, but it's probably between those two rather than the more modern ones, simply because I say these were ones that influenced me as a child, that stirred my imagination, made me thinking about Rome and the Romans and the Roman army and the tribes on the frontiers and all this sort of thing. So they've mattered a lot for me that way. Just before we finish on the Roman period, I'll throw in a mention. A couple of times people have raised the mini-series Masada, and yes, I will do videos on that. I've just got to find the time to sit down and watch it again, because I'm very fond of that. I'm including this briefly now because I think there was a cinema version released. There certainly was a film-length version that I had on video for years, was all you could get in Britain. Might have been called The Antagonists rather than Masada, or I can't quite remember. I know the novel on which it's based, I think, was called The Antagonists, which I've never read. They had the sequel to it in the local library, but they didn't have the original one for some whatever reason. Now, so just including it, the thing I remember as well is the deep frustration with this. It clearly took longer to produce before it got released. There was a program called Clapperboard, I think it was, on children's television on ITV, one of the channels over here when I was a kid, that for years seemed to have, every series there'd be a clip or two of this upcoming Masada, the antagonists, that looked fabulous. There were Roman soldiers, there was a Roman army camp, there were catapults, there was fighting, there was all sorts of stuff. They used to show very often the scene when the defenders have lulled them into a false sense of security. They haven't got any ammunition for their catapults, then bombard the Roman camp, and there's bits where jars of water are being smashed, all the water cascading out, people are panicking, things falling down, the work's being destroyed. It's a great scene. So if we could count that as a proper film, which I don't think we quite can, because I'm not sure what level of release it got, then that might be coming in, because that's got so much more Roman army stuff, and there's the confrontational aspect of it. And deep down there's the Josephus account of the siege of Masada is there, but there's a lot of imagination around it. So I think for the Roman Empire, those are really the favourites, with, as I say, it's probably vying between Spartacus and Fall of the Roman Empire, because of those few, there are slightly more battle scenes in Fall of the Empire than there are in Spartacus. A bit more Roman army stuff that I rather like, but again, you have all the chariot racing and the everybody, all the representatives from all the empire turn up for Alec Guinness to talk to them. He's going to promise everybody, give everybody Roman citizenship, which of course will happen under Caracalla not too long afterwards. And they're all arriving, and James Mason is prompting him. It's the nomenclator, the slave who stands beside you, prompting to tell you who you are so you can greet a Roman politician by name. It's quite nicely done, because there's the back and forth where there's one chap where neither of them know who this person is, and then another one where Alec Guinness corrects James Mason, and no, I think this is so, and it is, and that sort of thing, and then who is this? The next one as well. I mean, it's strange, because you have this idea that these are supposed to be governors from all the provinces, and then allied kings. There's a king of Armenia turning up and all this sort of thing. Sharif doing his stuff. So it's nice, but it's also rather weird, because when you think every governor is going to be a senator apart from Egypt, which means he's somebody that Marcus Aurelius has appointed and should know by face, because there's only about 600 senators. So it's artificial. It's again creating a different Roman Empire to them. But anyway, we'll talk about all that when we get to it. There aren't too many good late Roman Empire films. I suppose really you're only getting into the King Arthur stuff. You know, you've got things like The Last Legion, which builds towards that, which we may talk about one day, but we won't today, because it just doesn't quite work. There's the King Arthur one, the Keira Knightley's in it as the sort of Pictish queen or whatever she is. That it's got Hadrian's Wall in it, looking very pristine, and the sort of Roman garrison just walks away. I was always rather disappointed with that film because, okay, it's not. It's claiming it's trying to give a historical look, but clearly they're not too bothered about this. You know, why there is this, I think he's a senator or something living in a villa far to the north of Hadrian's Wall, and they have to go and rescue him. I think they went to this whole Sarmatian Night thing, but they basically turned them into the Magnificent Seven. I was deeply disappointed when I went to see this film, having heard that A, they weren't proper cataphracts, or Climinari or something like that, which seemed a grand opportunity to do that, but also that there were only this handful of them. You know, I felt at least there ought to have been 20 or 30, enough to look like a troop of cavalry to make a difference, rather than these handful of tough guys that go around and keep the frontier for the Romans. You know, there was a sense that it's not surprising the Romans were in trouble because there was hardly anybody anywhere. It's got, we'll probably do it one day because it's got lots of battle scenes in it. The barbarians, they're okay, they look fairly sinister, it's sort of moving towards pseudo-Vikings in the look. You know, they all look a bit like bikers, they're very black. It's a theme in so many historical films, particularly ancient films. Costumiers love to dress everybody really, really dark colours, and particularly in lots of black. It's actually very difficult to get a strong black colour with most natural dyes. It doesn't tend to last. So, you know, this is not how really look. Everything would be much more muted. And a lot of these groups liked colour, you know, where they could get it. And again, that would fade. But so it's, you know, I know it's marking them out. These are the bad guys. These are sinister. These are tough. You need to deal with them. You know, the battle scene doesn't make too much sense. You've got trebuchets and things like that. Well, okay, one of those cropped up in Gladiator 2, didn't it? At least one. Presumably a knockoff from Kingdom of Heaven or something like that. It doesn't make much sense, the idea these Picts turn up and suddenly know how to operate all this stuff, and it's all a bit strange. But I suppose it's an attempt. There's a few moments in it that are interesting, but again, we'll talk about that. But I don't think we can make that a favourite film. I think we've basically got to skip over the fall of the Empire because there isn't really anything that I know of that's terribly good. I mean, I think there's an old Hollywood epic about Attila the Hun that I seem to remember being pretty dreadful, but perhaps I'm being unfair. It's a long, long time since I've seen it. So let's move into the Dark Ages proper, or the early medieval period, if we want to be polite. I don't think there's been a terribly good Anglo-Saxon Viking movie. I mean, there's that old Alfred the Great one, isn't there? From the late 50s, 60s. That's pretty iffy. I think I've only seen it about once. It didn't really stick in my mind that much. I think the Vikings are all in black in that as well. But again, that might be my memory playing me false. I think for this I've got to go with Hector history, but it's good fun. And again, something I saw as a child on a Saturday afternoon, on a bank holiday afternoon, and it captured my imagination, is the old Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis, the Vikings. Partly because of the music in it, you know, the horn blowing, the do 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 do. I'm afraid that I find myself humming that every time I've seen that film for weeks afterwards. It just gets into my head. I didn't do it justice then, obviously, but I'm not the most musical of people. History-wise, you know, you've got the Welsh looking very medieval, the Saxons, it's and that strange clifftop castle and all this sort of thing. You know, there's Tony Curtis in a miniskirt. You didn't really want to see that either, but nevertheless, there's just an exuberance about it. It's very much, it's a popular imagination of Vikings. You know, all the pigtails and the axes and all this sort of thing. It's fun. it's got some impressive scenes. It's nice in the sort of the fjord area where they have the Viking village. There's obviously been more attention on television with the Viking series and The Last Kingdom and that sort of thing to that era, but we can't really count those, and I don't think we can count The Seven Kings Must Die, as it wasn't a cinema film. The Netflix one is the culmination of The Last Kingdom, even though, as I've said before, I was very, very slightly involved, and I'm credited on that for the helping out with some of the ideas for the battle scenes, and I'm quite proud of Brunanburg. I think it's got some very nice touches in it, and of some of the other ones I played a very small role in earlier in the series, but again, I don't think we can quite count that for today. So I think we're left with the Viking. I don't remember much. Is it the Northmen or the Longships? I think it is, with Richard Widmark or someone like that. I haven't seen that for years. I don't remember that much of it. I think that's again based on a novel. It struck me as the same sort of thing where history wasn't too much of an issue in too strict a sense. There was that recent one, The Northman, I didn't really take to. And there have been a few others sort of relatively low budget. So I think we haven't got a great Dark Age film yet. The closest, and this is really on the borders between Dark Age and medieval, I like the Charlton Heston film The Warlord, because it's one of those rare things where you actually see 11th century folk with good decent length mail armour, with helmets with nasal guards, with kite shields, with various swords, spears, axes, this sort of thing. And it gives a lovely feel. You've got the sense Charlton Heston is sent as the warlord. Basically it's sort of got that feudal aspect where he's sent to take charge of this area that's exposed to raids by Frisian pirates, and be the lord of the manor. Or it's basically based in this keep, this tower really on the shore, and govern the locals, administer justice, collect the taxes, the levies, this sort of thing for is it the Duke or the Count? I can't remember to whom he's reporting. You never see this off-stage presence. He's been sent there, and he's got this retinue of 20 or 30 so men, perhaps that sort of very small size. Some of them archers, some of them sort of milites, soldiers, this sort of thing, and it's his brothers with him and this sort of thing. It's a nice. We've got Richard Boone as the tough old warrior that's beside him, and he's always got a great presence in things, even if you do expect him always to be somewhere in the American West. I like it because of that. The plot is a little bit contrived. I'm not sure that it came from a novel or a stage play, the love affair that Charlton Heston has with this village girl. And I think he wasn't happy with the way the film developed. There's less on that. It goes more to the battles, which personally I like. Their romance doesn't quite work because it never quite explains why she suddenly flips from being really terrified of him to being desperately in love. The Frisian pirates are cut-price Vikings, basically. They look okay. They're very, very handy at building siege towers and battering rams, with throwing them up really quickly. But it's quite a nice series of escalating attacks on the tower. Some of it's well done. Even the thought of they get an anchor from a ship to the use as the hook that they'll pull the tower over, and this sort of thing. They're dropping stones, they're dropping oil, they're doing all this sort of thing. I just like it because it's a rarity. There's so little set in that period before you get to High Middle Ages and plate armour and all that sort of thing. You don't get a lot of this, and it's not as well known as a film as I think it deserves to be. So again, I think I saw it one Saturday or Sunday afternoon and thought, oh, this is good. And since then I've got it. I think I've got it now on Blu-ray. There's a very nice print of it out there. And it was, there's information on that where didn't quite, Charlton Heston had hoped for more. But the fact that he's got one of those pudding bowl Norman hairstyles, and the cast have, they made an effort to look the part. It does look a bit, even though it's filmed on the back lot of one of the studios rather than, I think they wanted to film it in the Fens in East Anglia. It looks nice, and the whole sort of paganism of the local villages and all this sort of thing, and Jus Prima Nocte and all this sort of thing. It's all a bit contrived, but then very often a film will have to be like any story to be. It's got a nice atmosphere. I rather like it. So that I think's got to go as the early medieval pick or Dark Age pick, depending on how you want to see the 11th century. I don't know. I mean, it's always felt a great shame. I think there was some Euro production, but 1066 and Hastings and lots of things seems crying out for a good film treatment. I think there's a BBC drama TV series coming out, but how good it will be, we'll wait and see. But it's a story that deserves more, I think. Now, moving on to the Middle Ages proper. There's quite a few films, but again, it tends to go certain ways. Obviously, one of the biggest, the commonest theme you get is the Robin Hood film. And I don't think I can talk about this without mentioning the Errol Flynn, Basil Rathbone one back from the 30s, because again, it's something I saw as a kid, and you know, who can buckle a swash as well as that? It's marvellous stuff, history-wise, deeply questionable in every respect. And you know, I remember reading that they had to go and they actually sprayed a lot of the leaves on trees green because they were filming it in the autumn in California and all this sort of thing. It doesn't look too much like Merry Old England, but it looks like Merry Old England on screen. Flynn's marvellous in it, and Rathbone as the villain. You know, it's a great, wonderful romp with a sort of vague medieval feel, and it's fun. And it's got longbows and sword fights and all that sort of thing. So it's got to be in there. Of the other Robin Hood films, again, I've got a soft spot for the Sean Connery Robin and Marion with Audrey Hepburn. Even if it's slightly strange, because they obviously, once they'd cast Connery as Robin Hood, they gave all the people in Nottingham a sort of vaguely Scottish accent. So you've got Ronnie Barker turning up, people like that as Friar Tuck, and they're all sort of talking in this, which is slightly odd. But you've got a great cast, and again, that there's some nice look. I mean, weirdly, they don't seem to wear trousers in it. So, you know, they've all got these long tunics and then leggings, which is slightly odd, but it's got a nice look, and it was filmed in Spain, so it's a bit too dry for Britain, but it's got its moments. You've got oh gosh, I've forgotten his name. Robert Shaw. You shouldn't forget that, given that my son's name is Robert. But he's marvellous as the sheriff, and has made this sort of, you know, much more the tough guy, the good soldier. The duel that he and Sean Connery fight, as you know, to decide the battle by single combat, I like it because they really look as if they're going at each other, but it's hard work. They get tired, and then the wounds come in, and they're really, you know, they're staggering to stand up. And it's quite a nice, brutally done, but gives a sense of how exhausting wearing armour is and fighting. And obviously they're supposed to be old men as well, so you know, history-wise, wouldn't worry about it too much. But it's a good entry in the Robin Hood canon. The Russell Crowe one, the Ridley Scott film for a few years back. I'll single out something because I remember the late John Coulston chatting to me about this when we were waiting to go in to do a talking head for some documentary or other, and it had not long been on. He liked it. He was very much, you know, an arms and armour and equipment man, along with many other things. You know, his Bishop and Coulston remains the place to go, the starting point when you're looking at Roman military equipment there, and so many other pieces as well. What was nice was that you've got, again, you know, helmets with conical helmets with nasal guards, this sort of thing. But some of the knights had painted helmets, and that bit of colour was just a nice touch. So although there were weird things like these medieval landing craft and all of that sort of stuff, and lots of, you know, the Freemasonry bit was a little bit odd. So it didn't quite work as well as you felt it ought to have done. And of course, it wasn't the Robin Hood story we were all expecting, which acts against it, because there are certain things, you know, everybody feels you've got to follow, and if you do the Kevin Costner route, then it's a lot easier. You know, things like that are fun, even if from that film you have them, they land in Dover, they then are at, you know, certainly where the tree's been chopped down, Sycamore Gap on Hadrian's Wall, and, you know, he assures his companion they're going to be in Nottingham by nightfall. You know, they didn't half travel in 24 hours in the 12th century. So it's fun, but that's a more conventional Robin Hood film. All of these, you know, they're quite quite fun, so I'll mention them, but I suppose we can't really count them as our favourite medieval films because it's, the border between folktales and fantasy is quite strong in this, as things that have attempted to present more history. I suppose I know I'm perhaps in a minority with this, but I have quite enjoyed Kingdom of Heaven. Crusade films are very rare, and obviously they're quite difficult and sensitive to make these days. I like if you ever get a chance to watch the extended version of it, the director's cut, I think that improves the film significantly, and I think it's a shame they didn't release it that way. I know that history-wise and accuracy-wise, it's it's only a bit more accurate than Braveheart, and I'm afraid I can't bring myself to include Braveheart in historical films because it just bears so little relation to what really happened that it's struggled, and it's and the Battle of Stirling Bridge without the bridge and all that. I struggle with that, so I'm afraid I know a lot of people have great fondness for it, and it's Mel Gibson's having fun and all that sort of thing, and it's fun, but it was a little bit too absurd. And Kingdom of Heaven I've enjoyed more, and I've gone back to watch more times. I haven't watched Braveheart for years now. I like the bits. I particularly like the bits when Liam Neeson goes home to find Orlando Bloom, Brennan Bloom, his son. Because in the director's cut again, you get this sort of slightly more sense that he's visiting the local Lord of the Manor is his brother. The chap who goes after him, the Game of Thrones bloke that he then kills, is his nephew, and that clash makes it all more interesting. There's a nice cavalry charge in it, even if it's not a terribly realistic cavalry charge. The one that Orlando Bloom leads, it's good cinema. It's quite nicely done. We'll come back to that when we do our cavalry month and we talk about how we should understand the Roman cavalry, and to do that we'll look at some bits from various films of different periods to give us a sense of numbers, pacing of charges, how cavalry combat works, that sort of thing. We'll do all of that in due course. Again, I've done talks on this in the past. So you have all of that. You've got the siege scenes. There's lots of fighting in it that again, Jerusalem is a little bit flat for my. The land around Jerusalem is, as anyone who goes there will tell you, is not like that. The city itself is very up and down, and it's quite fanciful. I suppose we'd been probably before then. We'd already seen. Well, they'd had Helm's Deep, and then the assault on Minas Tirith in the Return of the King. So we'd seen grand sieges, and there's an element of similarity within that. It's quite nice as well. You've got the fighting in the breach, which did sometimes happen when you try to defend things. It's, as I say, history is not its strong point in many respects. It takes an awful lot of liberties, but I guess it's quite like it as a film. There's a few bits where I think, okay, yeah, that's not bad. That means that probably because I'm not a medievalist, I did a little bit as an undergraduate, and I have to fight back the urge because I suspect I could get very, very interested very quickly, as I can in so much of history. So I've got to be a bit careful not to read too much these days. I think because it's not my period, I can enjoy it more than if, say, the same thing was set in the Roman era. So I think that will probably be my medieval one. The Last Duel, the other Ridley Scott film, it has its moments. Some of the houses, the castles they're in, show the signs of later work on them. They look a bit too modern for the 14th century. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Again, not my period. It's a film that definitely bears watching more than once. I enjoyed it more the second time because then you watch the first, because it's presented, the same events presented from three different perspectives. You notice the differences more, whereas the first time round you're not necessarily, or I didn't anyway, spot so much. It's obviously rather a grim theme, so it's not the most uplifting or cheerful film. But I thought it was well done. The duel at the end, the fight is spectacular. Not quite sure things would work like that, but again, it's spectacular. And I presume the weird helmets where half their face is left uncovered was just a device so that we could tell who was who. Because they've gone for quite a drab look. They haven't got... you know, in the old movies you'd have knights with a prominent surcoat on, different colours, so even if they had a great helm on or anything like that, we'd know who was who. And of course, you know, very quickly they take them off so we can see who everybody is. So it's got its moments. It's an interesting one. It's trying to create an atmosphere. But I know that there are plenty of medievalists who can't stand either of them. And perhaps if I knew more, I would get similarly worked up. And of course, these things very much taste what you like as a film. All the way through, I'm picking out things that I quite like. It's the same as novels. I don't like the history to be too outrageous, so I can put up with more in a film than I can on the page in a novel of terms of absurd inaccuracies. If the film's good enough to enjoy just as a film, but that's, you know, that's how it is. So that's the medieval take. Moving on into the early modern period, there's less, you know, there are fewer films, or certainly fewer films that have been memorable to me. I mean, I suppose again a medieval one I could mention things like The Name of the Rose had nice atmosphere, a bit like the novel itself. I found it a bit plodding in the end, and the mystery isn't really as exciting as you feel, or as intriguing as you feel it ought to be. For later stuff, I mean, you've got there was that whole spate of Columbus films, wasn't there, that I remember watching, but they didn't really stick in my mind that much. I'm not really enough of a samurai buff to know some of the Kurosawa and others, the sort of those historical films. You know, they haven't registered with me too much. So there's stuff, and there will be other things from cinemas from different parts of the world, and simply things I haven't seen, or they haven't made that much of an impression. Obviously, as you would have guessed from the start, you can tell by now, I'm inclined much more towards adventure, military stuff, battle skirmishes, that sort of thing, in my taste for this. So I suppose coming on, there's surprisingly little 17th century, and nearly all of it focuses on sort of Three Musketeers, or if not that, then Cyrano de Bergerac, that sort of thing. You know, you've got Cromwell about the English Civil War, and then there was that slightly weird black and white. Was it a horror film? I didn't last a year or two ago. I always think some good stuff about the English Civil War in that period would be nice, but it doesn't seem to interest people. Doesn't seem to get made. Because it's a fascinating period of history. Cromwell, again, I haven't watched for years. I bought not too long ago on DVD, and it's still in the wrapper because I haven't sat down to watch it with, you know, Richard Harris as Cromwell. I remember some big battle scenes that as a boy I quite liked, but I also remember a lot of other stuff. And mainly I think it's Alec Guinness again, the depiction of the trial of Charles I and his, you know, attitude coming in, you know, asking, by what right do you have to sit in judgment of me? I'm your king. That I thought was quite good. But I think really for the 17th century we're going more to things based on stories, and the Depardieu Cyrano de Bergerac film has, I think, one quite nice battle scene in it that I remember. I mean, it's fun as a film, but obviously based on the play, and I seem to remember a sort of mass pikeman that looked quite good, and there's the Viggo Mortensen, the Spanish Musketeer, based on is it Aristide, the Spanish novelist who's written those stories, that has a couple of brief sequences where you sort of see a tertio, and again, pikemen formed up that looks quite nice. There's not a lot to it as far as I remember, but it was enough to think, oh, that's good, I like that. I think I'm not sure if it's Polish or something else, I'm sure somebody once pointed me in the direction on YouTube of a film showing musketeers in ranks, but, you know, firing by rank and then either withdrawing or advancing so the next rank could come up and shooting and that sort of thing. I can't remember what that is, so again, I haven't seen the film proper, but we're probably really, it's Three Musketeers stuff. I didn't particularly I've watched the first one of the recent ones where again everybody's in black. It just didn't work for me. It seemed to go change the story too much. You know, these Huguenots plotting a sort of terrorist attack and all this sort of, it just seemed a bit odd. I think for me, you can't beat the 1970s, the Oliver Reed, Michael York, you know, Richard Chamberlain, all of Charlton Heston again. He's cropping up a lot, that fella, as Richelieu, the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers. They're wonderful romps. The sword fights are great. They're funny. You know, it's George MacDonald Fraser scripting them. The cast is fabulous. You know, Raquel Welch as Constance. Faye Dunaway as Milady de Winter. You know, you can't. And Christopher Lee as Rochefort. You know, it's marvelous stuff. They're funny. They're fun. Simon Ward as Duke of Buckingham. Those are great. I can sit down and watch those and just have a good time enjoying them. And there's some quite nice feel. The costuming, it's less drab and dark. It's okay. It's a decent sort of 17th century look. You've got there's not many battle scenes, but you've got the one with La Rochelle with the Huguenots. That's quite fun. So I think that's how we're going to get past the 17th century, because that's probably, those would be favourite. The later one, the Return of the Musketeers, obviously had the tragedy of the death of Roy Kinnear in it that I think affects the whole thing. There's a mood that's not quite, but that's a lot of fun, and I think Kim Cattrall is great fun in that. So it has, you know, I think those, and that of course we get a few sequences with Charles I. Apparently there were much longer sequences filmed with him playing golf with Billy Connolly as his caddy that sound as if they could have been really funny, and it's a shame they didn't make it through. But you know, that's the nature of things. So often a lot of good stuff doesn't make it, and in those days it literally ended up on the cutting room floor, whereas at least today there's a fair chance that digitally it will be preserved, so it might appear sometime as deleted scenes or even as a modified cut. So that's where we are there. There's surprisingly little. It just seems to go on. So let's go into the 18th century, where I think we're still waiting for a really good film about the 15 or the 45, the Jacobite Risings. You get various versions of Kidnap, but Culloden is a sort of peripheral thing. Preston Pan, that sort of thing. I just think that would be something would be nice to see. It would look good. It could be dramatic, done on a big enough budget, a big enough scale. There have been some smaller efforts, and obviously there's bits on TV and all that Slightly Strange Outlander series and all that sort of thing. Though again, they sort of skirted the edges of it. They obviously didn't really have the budget for big battles, and maybe that wasn't their focus. That's you've got for the 7 Years' War and that era. There's Barry Lyndon, of course, which it's a little bit like some of the epics we've talked about earlier for the ancient world. It's got a couple of marvellous scenes. The scene with the Redcoat Battalion advancing, then there's another one with the Prussians attacking, I think it is later on. The two battle scenes are very good, very impressive. They give a sense of the size. Normally, in any on-screen battle, 50 blokes are representing a regiment and they've all got flags. It hasn't quite got to the extreme flag proliferation of Ridley Scott's Napoleon, where everybody seems to have a flag and they're just everywhere and they're huge. Those are some nice sequences, but I found it's always been a bit, and the look of the thing, the sound, is all wonderful, but it is heavy going. It isn't something where I feel, I'm going to sit down and watch that every few months or every year or something like that. A long time has to go past before I think, I'm ready for Barry Lyndon again. So I like the look of it. I like some of the details, but it's as a film doesn't quite make it there. So I think let's move across the Atlantic, and probably going to be favourite. We'll jump on. I think we could do with more American Revolution, War of Independence films that were good, because it's a fascinating period. You've got Mel Gibson's The Patriot, which is sort of Braveheart without kilts. The Battle of, it's sort of cross between Guildford Courthouse and Cowpens at the end, has more people in it than the real battle had. But they're all in these pristine, the British are all in these sort of 1775 uniforms, that by then they're not wearing. You've got the bit where I can't remember what they call him, but the basically Banastre Tarleton character, which is based with his Green Dragoons. They just have a little strip of green because everybody on the British side has to wear red. it's a shame because I think it's an interesting period. The issues that were at stake are important ones, and that basically turns it into a personal revenge story because of this loyalist unit that only apparently has one American in it. Dragging people into church and burning it down, all this sort of thing. And brutal though the low key the war was in the southern states, in elsewhere during the war, that sort of thing didn't happen. It's trivializing it, whereas you feel the causes involved were actually more important to people and the motivations than just this. Well, there are these monsters killing my family, therefore I've got to go and seek revenge, and that's why they'll get independence. It sort of doesn't quite work. It was interesting to see. It was one of the first films in recent years that had obviously CGI round shot skipping along, smashing people, decapitating them rather than just exploding as things normally do. But I mean, those cannon are ridiculously large for anything you'd want to drag around in the field. So it's again, it's got its moments. It's got a couple of nice battle scenes, but they're overdone. They're not so realistic, and it ends up with Mel Gibson, laying around himself with the tomahawk. You've got that time when he ambushes about 20 odd redcoats and with his children just slaughters them all. It just doesn't. It's too exaggerated. It's a shame because there were some stages in it where you thought, oh, actually they're going in the right direction. They could have done something. It could still have been fiercely patriotic and all this sort of thing, which I'm British, obviously, so perhaps I have a slightly different view of the whole business. You could have done a much better one with the same budget. And it's frustrating because you feel it's going and it's starting off with some good ideas, and then it turns into something else that's just a bit lazy. So I think there's that old John Ford Henry Fonda film, isn't there? From a name escapes me, but I'll flash it up on the screen when we get here. Where they're fighting their settlers on the frontier. That's got its moments, and they're fighting mainly against the local tribes, so it's not facing redcoats as such. I think we'll have to go for an 18th century film as The Last of the Mohicans, because again, history is pretty iffy, and compared to the book, pretty iffy. But it's a great film. I mean, it's one of those things where the levels of violence are actually quite high, and it's always a bit surprising it got away with the certificate it did. I think because it's presented in a way that you sort of get carried along with it. But, some of those people get clobbered by clubs or tomahawks and this sort of thing with bits of flesh sticking off their head. It's quite brutal. And at times the music is so heavy, and it's almost like a sort of prolonged pop video. I think it's got to come in here, and it'll be my favourite because of the siege scenes, where there's some that again are largely done to music, where you have, and they clearly put effort into this, you've got the sappers zigzagging their way forward, digging the trenches towards the wall, they're setting up batteries, you've got the gunners inside trying to hit the gabions, the wicker baskets full of earth at the front of this, knocking them down, inflicting casualties, but they keep going. That look of a siege is really quite good, and you don't often get that sort of thing in film. So for that, the rest of it, lots of romps. I don't see, again, perhaps this is just me being terribly British and terribly English about all of this, the whole sort of let's anticipate the revolution element in it, where you have the promise made that the militia can go home if their homes are threatened, and then that's reneged upon by the wicked British, and there's this whole thing about the British are bad, the French are bad, and it's just I think the settlers seem to be okay because they're poor, but otherwise, unless you're one of the forest tribes, then you really shouldn't be here, which is fine and all very well, but it's a bit strained, it's a bit over the top. I don't think people were thinking like that at the time, and again, you're still our main characters are Daniel Day-Lewis and what's the actress's name for the love interest? Who's playing? Is she Cora or whatever? It's a film I can watch reasonably often and enjoy every time. It's not perfect. It's takes a lot of liberties, but there are nice scenes. That ambush scene of the Red-Coated Company, again, while exaggerated and clearly, I think, has the Braddock's expedition in mind, because this company is particularly stupid in the way they behave. but it's quite nicely done for a cinematic offering. The siege, I think, is great. The chases, the excitement. Again, it's pretty grim. And you'll notice the way the story is told is significantly different to those who've read the books. There's the sort of obviously they were uncomfortable with the racial aspect of the book, but it's quite grim. There is something where a young woman jumps off a cliff to commit suicide. That's pretty nasty. So there's elements within it each time where you think, okay, yeah, that hasn't exactly cheered me up, but there's enough in it that's well done. And the look of it is very good. So I think that's our 18th century film, even if it's sort of off a little bit. Let's come now to Napoleonic era, that sort of thing. I think let's start with The Duelist, Ridley Scott's debut, and the one that got people so excited when we heard he was doing a film about Napoleon, and that sort of raised our expectations rather higher than was fulfilled, to say the least. It's a marvellous little film where you have this obsessive, these constant fights between these two hussar officers. The uniform details, lovely. The little detail, the look of it is very good. It's there's not grand scenes, there aren't lots of extras, it's all very small scale, it's simplified, but the way they change the cadenets, the pigtails they have early on and then they lose. The sword fights are really well done. Again, they look brutal, they look as if these two guys are really going at each other. The bit where one of them gets his shoulder quite badly chopped, it's nasty, it's shocking, it's wonderful. The attention to detail in it is good. It's an interesting, intriguing little story. So that's got to be mentioned, but it isn't really about the bigger events. I've watched years ago, it was on one of the television channels here, the Able Glance, the silent Napoleon film, that again's got its great moments, it's spectacular. I'll look forward to, I've just bought it on DVD, watching that again. Haven't seen it for years. But again, it's a very long silent film that you don't get to see very often. I don't think it can quite come in as our favourite for the era. More for a nice scene than the theme, because obviously it's set post 1815. Le Colonel Chabert, the Gerard Depardieu, Fanny Ardant film, has that marvellous scene. First of all, they're sort of clearing up the aftermath of Eylau, but then the cavalry charge. You don't often get to see cuirassiers, and Depardieu is the right build as a big chunky cuirassier colonel. It's too fast. Again, this is a charge we'll come back to when we're talking about how cavalry is depicted, but also what that can tell us about how cavalry really seem to have fought in the Roman period and others in the future. But the sense of the ground thundering as these big men on big horses come towards you. Again, the cuirassiers, by the time of Eylau, their horses were in such a state that few could make more than a trot, certainly, charging. So again, it's not quite right for the time, but it's great cinema, and it gives that sense of power. And if anybody knows in the comments, I've never been able to discover, the unit in it has a red standard, and I'm not quite sure what that's based on, whether that's something they've got from the consular period or earlier, that perhaps a unit still had these. It looks like the sort of detail where you feel maybe somebody's found something. It's not the normal tricolour that you'd have for the pattern of that period. And I've always wondered, but I've never been able to find anywhere what it is or what it's based on, or it might just be that somebody in the props department invented it, in which case I'm disappointed, but I just wondered. Anyway, that's an aside. Again, we're coming back to fiction rather than history. The various adaptations of War and Peace have a big element for this, and particularly the 1960s, the Bondarchuk, the Soviet extravaganza, where you have these vast numbers of extras, grand sweep of things. If you can get the Blu-ray of it, it's well worth it. It really looks fabulous. The older one, the Audrey Hepburn as Natasha, and is it Henry Fonda as Pierre? The Hollywood one, much more condensed, much shorter, less of the book. It's got some nice scenes in it, but doesn't quite match that scale. So that one's got to be a major contender. The Russian War and Peace, filmed in Ukraine, ironically enough. So there's an interesting book about its the making of the film. That you're talking about places that are now a war zone. Some of the divisions there between the extras, but it's hard to imagine any great epic being made in this way now, where somebody provides thousands of soldiers, hundreds of cavalry to take part, and there's a unit that was specifically maintained to support the film industry, to be cavalry in films. So you have, sorry, the book's about the making of Waterloo, not War and Peace, but it's obviously same director and same locations and extras. I think I'll favour Waterloo over War and Peace for all its many failings, and we'll come on to those in a minute. But there's great scenes in War and Peace, but it's an adaptation of the novel. It's trying to be faithful to that, and it's pretty good. And I can't remember the actress's name, but then Natasha is very good. The way she sort of grows with the part. But when you have spectacular battle scenes, I think the Austerlitz ones are probably the best. Often they're quite impressionistic. Now that reflects Tolstoy's descriptions, which, as a combat veteran himself, he'd been in the Crimean War. His battles are very confusing. There's noise, there are people running around, and there's emptiness, there's silence. It gives a reflection of that, but some of the bits where they divide up the screen and you get these sort of whirling things, the historian in me, particularly the Napoleonic enthusiast, would love to see close-ups of these regiments, those uniforms, doing things, rather than sort of blurred over each other and all this sort of thing. So I think Waterloo, I'll take over this because, again, same director, same system of extras. It's the Soviet army providing the cast of thousands, literally, that again you just will not get. You'll get it CGI, but you won't get real people doing this. And there's a different look. Maybe the CGI will get clever enough that in the long run it can replicate this, but it tends to be too neat, and tends to have too much, tends to be too crowded. So Waterloo has lots of problems. You can argue about. I quite like Rod Steiger in it, but it's a pretty manic performance. I like Christopher Plummer as Wellington. He's probably a bit nicer than the real Wellington, but again, you could say that about both the Wellingtons in the Sharp TV series, which again I think we'll have to leave for TV, because even though they were film length, we'll do that. So when we're talking about land, and we'll come on to the sea in a moment, I think it's got to be Waterloo, because although it grossly simplifies the battle, and there's a lot that was apparently in the script that's gone. You briefly see, the Scots Greys that become both the Union Brigade and the Household Brigade. Their charge that's far too fast, but it's spectacular and grand. There is one scene where, if you look closely, you can actually see some French infantrymen retreating ahead of them towards the gun batteries. But basically, the main point of that charge, to take out the developing French infantry attack, is gone completely. They just sort of hurl themselves at the French, go too far, get slaughtered by Polish lancers. You've got all these fellas in these nice blue and crimson uniforms as the First Regiment of the Guard. There was only one squadron of those actually at Waterloo, the ones that had been with Napoleon in exile. Whether they were wearing that uniform or not's another. But okay, it's just possible that there's ways you could say, well, it's just possible they're there, but they probably weren't. They were probably line lancers in green. But there's enough. You get the Carabineers, you get the Cuirassiers, you get the 5th Hussars crop up, you get, very briefly, you see some British heavy dragoons apart from the Scots Greys. You don't get any Hussars. Mostly the Allied army is British, and it's all in red, apart from the gunners. To their credit, they've kept the gunners in blue. The looks of Wellington's staff, you have Brunswickers and Austrians and all sorts represented in the background. It's nice. There's a lot of detail there. I was given the book based on by the costumier of the thing about Armies of Waterloo, that had a lot of the information they'd gathered for the costume department for that when I was a small boy, and it caught my imagination from that moment. That's never slackened. So it's there. It's good. It's grand, it's heavily stylized, there's lots that's wrong, there's lots that's frustrating. The attack of the Imperial Guard, when the British Guard sort of keep popping up and then shooting and ducking down, and people stand up behind them and shoot. Not like the real thing, but as Hollywood battles go, it's grand, it's impressive. So I think that's got to be my favourite for land, at least, and land warfare in that era. At sea, obviously, again, we've got to have a mention. I think people will probably have guessed what the favourite is going to be in this respect, but I do like the old Gregory Peck Hornblower film. Virginia Mayo in it as Barbara Wellesley and all this sort of thing is very glamorous, and they work well together. It's quite faithful to the novels. You know, there's some good the gun battles between them. And in the past, we've had pirates mostly for our on-sea battles, and with those, I don't think you can beat Captain Blood and some of those early ones. I don't think the more modern ones have ever really worked, and obviously the whole Pirates of the Caribbean franchise was not about history, even remotely, or piracy, because they didn't do any of that. It was all about, you know, some theme park ride expanded into a story, all very well, but I don't think history is a concern, so it doesn't mention. But I do like that. It's, you know, it's quite well done. Again, it used to crop up on television in weekend afternoons, summer holidays, that sort of thing, and I'd love watching it. It was great stuff. So that's still, I have a soft spot for that, but I think we've got to go with Master and Commander. Is it Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World? The full title, the Russell Crowe, Paul Bettany film, because it looks fabulous and it sounds fabulous, and I'm a big fan of the Patrick O'Brian novels, as I've said in the video on those. So there's something about it. It's very well done. I know purists will say the frigate isn't quite right. You know, it's a bit too short and stubby, but it's close enough. You know, again, by Hollywood standards, it's pretty good. It's partly a shame they didn't have the privateer as American. They made it French. You know, changed the book. But again, I can understand some of it's a bit contrived. You know, the officer who sort of basically has a breakdown, goes mad. That didn't quite work for me. But the Paul Bettany, Russell Crowe back and forth does work, and when they're playing in his cabin and this sort of thing. And as I say, I think I mentioned before, Russell Crowe won me over with the lesser of two Weevils joke, which I it felt in, because obviously, having read the stories, I had quite a fixed idea of how I imagined these two characters, and they're physically not much like them in either case, but they work very well together. It was good performances. It looks marvellous. It sounds marvellous. You've really got the two battles that are very well done. In the sense, I like again, this is from reading the stories, those scenes where you have the one ship and then just the distant sail almost on the horizon of them chasing, and that sense of you're pursuing someone, but it takes days, you know, and everything takes hours to happen. So I think it's got to be there for atmosphere, for the feel of it all. It's a very good film. The main regret about it is, as a fan, I would have loved them to have made some more, because those novels are, you know, a very rich source for that sort of material. So anyway, so moving on from the Napoleonic era, let's go to, well, there's not much on the Crimean War. There's the old Errol Flynn Charge of the Light Brigade, which bears very, very little relation to history indeed, with the strange fact that the regiment involved, I think they're the 27th Lancers, they've made one up, they have an experience in India, where a lot of the film is set, that is quite close to what happened at Kanpur. So, in a strange sort of way, which of course didn't happen until several years after the Crimean War. The 60s one, the Charge of the Light Brigade, is very much of its time. It's worth including because there are some good scenes in it. You know, the battles of the Alma, the charge itself is not too bad. Again, we'll come back to that when we talk about cavalry. I like some of the barrack room scenes and the regimental scenes with the hussars in England beforehand. It's obviously very much of its time. It's very political, you know, the upper class are bad guys sort of thing. The message is a little bit too heavy at times, but they've tried to get a Victorian atmosphere for a lot of it that works quite well. It's not very fair to Fanny D'Urberly, but the cast are clearly having fun in a lot of times, particularly Trevor Howard. So it's got its moments, and you know, the whole sort of the mistakes where Raglan's talking about, and we'll advance on the French and all this sort of thing. I mean, the thing is, the real war was such a shambles from the British point of view that you don't need too much exaggeration. I confess I find the cartoons in it of, you know, based around those sort of cartoons of the period, but then they're animated. The first time I saw it, for the first one or two, you thought, oh, okay, that's quite fun. They just get a bit annoying now. They just go on and on. It's a sort of 60s experimental thing that doesn't quite last for me. But I suppose that's how we're going for sort of mid-Victorian, early Victorian stuff. It would be nice to have good films about the Sikh Wars or the Indian Mutiny, that sort of thing, but I can't see those getting made. There was that Ballad of Mangal Pandey a few years ago, but it was all before the war, and it was so heavy stylized. And again, I'm not really used to the conventions of Indian cinema because I haven't seen too much. So even though sometimes I've watched, this is impressive. The music, the dancing, it's not what I expect. So I don't naturally go to that. Let's go on to the American Civil War instead. Obviously, there's a lot on that. Not my period, because I feel that if you dabble a toe, you'll very soon dive in head first, because there's a wealth of material and it's very interesting, and the causes involved and the amount of personal accounts and the big personalities you have. So I remember speaking at VMI a few years back, and you can't help starting to think of elsewhere, even going to Yorktown, and you see the trenches and the traces of the Civil War earthworks there. So or going through Harper's Ferry, and there's elements where I could very easily get sucked into this, but I'm trying to stay clear, just because it'll absorb a huge amount of my time if I do go that way. So I'll have to again mention one which I'm sure will produce groans from the period specialist enthusiast, but again, it comes to a child watching what was on television in the days before video, and let alone streaming services and all this sort of thing. What came on? Good films with excitement, with history, with battles in. I've got a soft spot for the old John Wayne, John Ford horse soldiers. I know, yes, there's a loose connection with the Grierson raid and all this sort of thing, but it's very loose. And of course, again, there's another film that suffered a tragedy with the death of a stuntman, so it has a flatter ending than perhaps it should have had. But William Holden, John Wayne are good in it. It's got some great scenes. I like the old, the John Ford, the cavalry look. We won't go into detail into the West, because that's really a different theme. Rio Grande in particular, of the cavalry trilogy, I rather like. I think it's partly because of Maureen O'Hara. I just think she's great, and she and John Wayne are always great together. But it's again, these are John Ford telling good stories and entertaining stories, and the history is, like was it Dumas said, history is but the nail on which I hang my stories. It's as close to that. This isn't going to teach you too much about the reality, but it's a fun film. I think Gettysburg does stand up. Again, it's based on a novel, and it has things that are heavily fictionalized and obviously simplifies things, but there aren't too many films based around a battle that try and tell you the story of that battle and do a reasonable job of it. It's better than Waterloo in that respect, partly because it's twice the length. And some of the scenes in it are very good. I think particularly Pickett's charge, but particularly I like the preparations for it, as they're forming up, as they're moving forward, as they're going through the gun line. I quite like all of that. Again, the regiment's probably too small, but that sense of the bombardment, where you do get a lot of cannon firing. Again, I was lucky enough, it had a limited cinema release over here. Seeing that on the big screen, it's a big thing. Gods and Generals, similar, but it doesn't quite work as well for me. I found the novel, somebody learning me that, and I didn't really get into it. The style's different, whereas The Killer Angels is a very good read. So again, people can correct me, because this is not my period, but there's enough of history in those for me to enjoy. And I enjoy Gods and Generals now and again, but it's just a bit more of a slog. But Gettysburg's a good film to watch when you want that sense of a big battle. Even the little bits in the dialogue where you've got Buford earlier on, and the Confederates are bumping into him, and he talks about the time it'll take for them to organise. There's some attempts to give you an idea of how long it took armies to move and form up that you only occasionally get on screen. So it's nice to have, but it's not it's not perfect by any means, but it's something. So I've enjoyed those. So that's probably where we'll leave it for that. I mean, perhaps there are other films. Glory is a very good film. I remember seeing that in the cinema when it came out, and the Fort Wagner scenes are very well done. I quite like the earlier skirmish they had. I mean, I remember afterwards I did read a bit, and I found a memoir of somebody who'd been in the 54th Massachusetts and all this sort of thing. So I realised then how much of the film deviated from the reality of that. But of course, it's an interesting thing, and it looks nice. It's and it's a heck of a cast in it. So that one's up there. That's a more detailed aspect of it, but I've got a soft spot for that. The Last Samurai, which was the same director, I suppose, taking us a bit later into the 19th century, is fun now and again, but I haven't quite got into that in the same way. But, impressive battle scenes and all this thing, if not 100% realistic by any means. And I did feel sorry for those poor conscripts that were getting chopped up by Tom Cruise and his chums in the later thing, because you just felt these poor blokes conscripted. I assume, I don't know enough about the Japanese army at the time, probably didn't want to be there, and I couldn't quite see them as the villains. But there we go. Anyway. Looking more broadly at the later 19th century, the Victorian era, the imperial era of the British Empire, all this sort of thing, there's some good ones out there. Not long ago I watched Khartoum on Blu-ray. Again, Charlton Heston, the man's popping up everywhere, who, although he's a lot taller than the real Gordon was, I think gives rather a good performance. And it hadn't struck me before, but having heard that Laurence Olivier didn't ever leave Britain, so he was never on location there, I'd forgotten that every scene with him in it's sort of framed closely. But the destruction of Hicks Pasha's army, stylized Hollywood, but it's quite impressive. There's something about the Egyptian army of that era I just quite like, and you don't often get these sorts of forces depicted on screen. Takes an awful lot of liberties with history. On the other hand, in essence, I like the bits with Gladstone and the marvellous scene. Again, it's fictional, but it's of Gladstone talking to Gordon, and sort of Gordon, seeing through the bluff, saying, "Well, this is a token to save the government, and when I fail and get killed, you'll just shrug your shoulders and say, well, we sent Gordon, we sent the hero. We couldn't do more than that." I like it enough. I happen to watch on the Blu-ray, they have documentaries by several film critics talking about it, who are very informative on that aspect, the production and the backgrounds of the people involved, screenwriters, directors, all this sort of thing. Clearly didn't like the film, which was a little bit strange when you're recording this thing on it. It struck me, as you often get with these things, the one thing they weren't really talking about to any extent was the history, because it's not their thing. And there's a lot you could fault about the history, but there's also, in essence, there's quite a bit of truth in it. And it's an interesting thing. And the whole situation, you feel Gordon was one of these slightly odd, very odd mavericks, who did disobey his orders and do his own thing. On the other hand, the way they present it as a moral thing, you feel, there's an element of this is a heroic thing to do. Yes, they present him in the end, it's based on the classic painting of how he dies and all this thing. It's quite good. You've got a little bit of the relief column, the camels fighting, all this sort of thing. It's quite impressive. I mean, the only other films that tend to touch the Sudan are various versions of The Four Feathers. And I'll have to one day, I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere, try and search out the silent version that I think had, Fay Ray of King Kong fame was the love interest in it. That might be interesting. The Corder one from the 30s is really interesting because of the look of it all, the way the soldiers look like soldiers, because they are the grand scheme of the Omdurman scene. I mean, they've moved it later. It's not at the early period. It's later on. So I think it's Abu Clare is the battle. You have that recent oddity, the Heath Ledger one, where the director expressed quite clearly that he's not a fan of the British Empire, so he's trying to make an anti-imperialist imperial boys' own adventure, and it doesn't really work for that reason, because he clearly quite likes the story and the idea, but you feel that it hasn't quite worked out which way I'm going, and it ends up being nothing in particular, and it's the Ansar, the dervishes, they win at Abu Klea, and they sort of wipe out this thing, whereas it's supposed to be a small detachment there. They broke into the square there, and it's a pretty brutal thing, but the British didn't lose the battle, though they did fail in the strategic objective of the campaign. And that doesn't quite work. And the other frustrating thing with that is that you see them sort of moving around. They have a Gatling gun they're carrying around. You never get to see it shoot, which bothered me. It's Chekhov's Gatling gun, I suppose. So those are the only other treatments of the Sudan, and I don't think any of them quite work as well. I think Khartoum, to me, some people say it's a bit slow, it's a bit ponderous, and it does take liberties. I rather like it as a film. It's something I will watch every year or so, sit down and enjoy. However, I think for this era, we've got to go to, my favourite is very definitely Zulu. Zulu Dawn has its moments, but it just doesn't quite work as a film, even though, it's interesting, I've been to Fugitives Drift and they filmed those scenes with Coquille and Melville and Verica, the Simon Ward character, actually there. And it's striking, it is weirdly sandy on that stretch of the riverbank there. So I've been there, I've done, and lots of others, the Isandlwana itself is not at Isandlwana, but it's similar, whereas in Zulu there are a lot more historical liberties, and it is very fictionalized, the friction between the Chard and Bromhead, that's all invented. You've got the missionaries there, Mr. DeWitt wasn't there at the time of the battle, though he later claimed to be. He didn't stay there. He didn't have, gorgeous young blonde daughter. His children were children at that age. All of that's rather contrived. Henry Hook wasn't like that. Dalton, they added in as an afterthought because they realised they had a VC winner they didn't really account for. He wasn't the sort of rather effete Clark-like man, although he was a acting assistant commissary. He was a former sergeant in the light infantry. This was, and clearly a major figure in the defence. Hence the fact that he gets the VC, and some of the others, and they weren't the Borderers at that time. They were the Warwickshire Regiment, or I think 2nd Warwickshires. But there were quite a lot of Welshmen. The depot was at Brecon. They should all have had great thick beards, but again, that wouldn't look good. The uniforms aren't quite right. You've got the helmet plates, the white helmets still. There's lots that's wrong. There's lots about the battle that's stylized. Less of it occurred in daytime. It's a wonderful scene near the end where you have the Zulus geeing up and singing, and then the Welsh sing with Ivor Emanuel start off at Men of Harlech. It's a great scene. It didn't happen, but it's a great scene. There's a lot that's in that. A lot more of the fighting was under cover of darkness, and they have a few scenes that do that quite well. So there's lots that's trying. I don't, there's no evidence for the cattle stampede and for an awful lot of it. But on the other hand, the claustrophobic fighting within the hospital, it gives quite a good sense of that. The desperation of it all, the sense of exhaustion, and the Zulus are presented. Yes, they're essentially faceless. They don't develop as characters, and the attempts to do that in Zulu Dawn didn't quite work. The novelisation of it, written by Cy Enfield, actually had a lot more of that, and it sort of gave them more personalities and motivation, but there wasn't space for that in the film. Yes, they are a bit faceless, but on the other hand, they are presented as very brave, very capable, very skillful, and probably rather too favourably when the missionaries are heading off and they're about to ambush them and they're just waved down and obey. Warfare in southern Africa in this era tended to be a bit more brutal than that, because you fought to make it very clear that the enemy was there to be eaten up, and not to fight the king again. But it's a marvellous piece of cinema. Its location is not the real thing, and the surprising thing when you go to Rorke's is how tiny the area is. The scenery is less spectacular. They filmed this in a national park area rather. So there's a lot that's fictionalized. There's a lot that's wrong, but it's a really good film. I mean, perhaps it helps. Wales is my home. I've grown up, so I think it has something special for anybody with a connection. But it's just a really good film, and I think it's got to be my favourite historical film, because even if there's an awful lot of liberties, there's an awful lot that's wrong, you can still see that there's enough elements of the truth that it is not completely an Hollywood invented thing. There's more than you actually get in very many supposedly historical films. Moving on a little bit into early part of the 20th century, or the turn of the century, Young Winston with Simon Ward's a good film. I've just read My Early Life recently, on which it's based. Again, it's got some nice scenes in it. The bits on the northwest frontier, the charge of the 21st Lancers, the ambush of the armoured train. Okay, it's filmed in North Wales, which doesn't look a lot like South Africa, but there aren't many. I think sometimes as a film, it's a little bit overlong. The pacing doesn't quite work all the time. You want a bit more action, I think, but it's it's fun, and Simon Ward is really good in it. But I think when we're moving on to this era, the film it's got to be is Breaker Morant, of the trial of these three Australian officers accused of shooting Boer prisoners of war and a German missionary. It's a terrific film. I mean, again, it's got that like Zulu. It's really well put together. The performances are great. It feels a bit stagey because obviously within the courtroom, but it lends itself to that of the questions, the answers, the overreaction. Edward Woodward's great. I mean, I like the bit where that talks about Law 303, and you get the rifle box being worked and all this sort of thing. And he loses his temper. He's very good in it. Brian Brown's very good in it. The whole cast is good. It's not got a huge budget, but it's very focused on the story it tells. It's a dramatic story. It's interesting, if you go to the Australian War Memorial Museum in Canberra, which if you're ever anywhere near that area, make the effort. It's a superb museum. They had a bit when I went there, talking about the incident, and then they're even inviting you to vote. Do you think they should have been executed or not? And it's one of those difficult things. They were scapegoats. It was all to do with proving a point and trying to show that the British had been fair and hadn't broken any of the rules as they were heading towards a peace treaty, trying to bring the war to an end. The problem is there's a good purpose to it all, but they're doing something terrible. On the other hand, it becomes clear, as it does in the film, they did kill the German missionary. Maybe he needed killing, but nevertheless they did that, and that they're not presented as saints, but they are presented as interesting people, and you do sympathise with them because you can see the odds just being stacked against them. It's just very, very well done. And the use of music, you have a regimental band playing sort of in outside, the way it works with all the patriotic things, and even to the point of Edward Woodward singing Soldiers of the Queen after they've been executed. It's very moving. It's very well done. So it's not bad history. They've kept pretty close to the events, and partly because they had the records of the trial. And it is a real-life tragedy. It is deeply moving. But it's a very good film as well, and it's very entertaining, and it looks right, and it shows what you can do with not a spectacular budget, not a cast of thousands. It's all quite small scale. Yes, there's the Boer attack on the where the trial's being held and the base there. That's a bit Hollywood, not with the numbers of Hollywood, but the way it's done, and getting out the Maxim gun and firing down this sort of lane and this sort of thing. But it's was it Brian Brown's character said, well, that breaks the monotony or something like that. It's well done. And that helps to relieve just the court aspect, because everything else is flashbacks to what's going on. So it works as a film, even if it doesn't quite work as straight history. I suppose you've got the 55 Days in Peking from the Singapore, which is interesting about the Boxer Rising and the way the legations came together. I think it was filmed in Spain. A lot of the cast are playing Chinese and are not Chinese. It's a little odd. David Niven's good though. Charlton Heston, there's the man again. He seems to be cropping up all the time in this video. I like it because it's a fascinating period, and I love the scenes early on when you have the legations waking up and all the national anthems being played and competing with each other, blurring into one. So that's got its moments, but it has flaws as well. You've got Ava Gardner, but even so, it doesn't quite work. But it's an interesting thing about an era that's often forgotten. So that's taking us now. We're getting on to the First World War, and that period again, there's lots of other, I suppose, Victorian Edwardian stuff that I haven't really got time to talk about. For First World War films, it's quite hard, especially for the war on land. The war in the air is always an interest of mine, so we'll say a little bit about that first. You've got Wings, the old silent films, well worth a look, and some of the battle scenes are spectacular in that. But it is also very much of its time in the way the story's told. But it's pre-Hays Code, so some of it's quite raunchy. The dogfights are pretty good. They've got some spads. They haven't got, I can't remember what the Germans are flying, but they're not period aircraft. It doesn't go down the sort of Hell's Angels route, which is very much pulp novels and magazines and stories about ace fighter pilots. And that's obviously a tendency, the way these things go. Flyboys, the fairly recent one, did that a little bit. You know, there were a few too many cliches and a few too many, let's pack as many aircraft as we can into this space, even though it had some nice three-dimensional dogfights. And the temptation, you know, there's a Zeppelin involved. Well, they were very rare in France because they were too vulnerable. The bombers they escort Handley Page multi-engine things, rather than, say, you know, DH4s or DH9 or something simpler. You don't get the sense of patrolling, and it's all a bit too... It's I like it in some respects. It's got some nice things, but it's annoying the Germans are all flying Fokker triplanes. That's just, and all red Fokker triplanes apart from the Ace in black. That's just irritating. You know, apparently there'd been a possibility at one point they were going to use an Albatross, which would have been much more accurate. Multicoloured Albatri would have been a lot more fun. Anyway, so that can't make it as our favourite. The Blue Max, I have a soft spot for that, the George Peiord film. Based on a novel again, a little bit stylized. James Mason playing a German, there's a surprise, you know, when he's not playing Rommel, he's usually German. Good dogfights in it, filmed in Ireland. The battle scene's a bit theatrical, a bit Hollywood, but spectacular. You have to look closely. Again, this was the first thing I ever bought on VHS tape. Because I've been wanting to see it, I've been interested, and I watched it a lot of times, so I have a soft spot in my heart for it for that reason. It's again a bit slow. There's perhaps, I was going to say a bit too much Ursula Andress, which seems a shame to say, but there's the romance bit of it sometimes gets me. I'd like more dogfighting. But some of those dogfights are very, very good. Again, the Germans didn't tend to arm their scouts with bombs and use them to bomb. They were more specialised than that. So some of the behaviour they're doing is actually more like the way the Royal Flying Corps and then the RAF flew. But it's quite nice. It's got its moments. That's worth a look. Aces High from the 70s. I saw this in the cinema when it came out. So that, again, gives it a special place in my heart. It's based on Journey's End. It doesn't quite make sense for the Flying Corps, but it works. The cast is good. Christopher Plummer cropping up again. Simon Ward again. Where it's got some nice dogfights. The aircraft, they didn't have many real ones. There's a Fokker Eindecker or reconstruction that's in it, and you occasionally get bits taken from other movies where you'll get proper SE5s, but they sort of converted some de Havilland or something into, it looks like an SE5 a bit, and the Germans are in all sorts, but it's quite nicely done. You get the balloon busting at the end, which again is one of those interesting phenomena that you just had for those few years and then you'll never get again, didn't have before. I quite like it, but I think I've got to come back to the Dawn Patrol with Flynn and Niven and Rathbone. And again, get those sorts of names in your cast, and you know you're onto a winner. It's stylized. It's obviously the thing I hadn't realized until recently. It's a remake of I think it was called Flight Commander or something like that, basically word for word. It was one of the early films of Douglas Fairbanks Jr. A few years before, and they had, I don't know whether they've changed it because they've remodeled the Air and Space Museum in Washington DC, but they used to have in the First World War section quite a nice film of Fairbanks talking about fighter pilots and how the First World War has been presented on film. It was just quite interesting, but I've never actually seen the full version of that. But the Flynn one is good. It's stylized, but it's got a serious message to it. Obviously, the technical advisor must have served either with the Lafayette squadrons, or I assume when the Americans went over, they were trained in the main by the French, because most of them had French equipment and aircraft like the Spads and Newports and things. There were some that were given Sopwith Camels and SE5s and so were the British, but mostly because all the orders are given in meters for height of patrolling, which you definitely 1917 Royal Flying Corps you wouldn't be doing. So that's an oddity where it's somebody obviously remembering how it was done, but how it was done in a different squadron. And obviously it's stylized at the end, and when Errol Flynn goes off and he's dropping the equivalent of sort of 20-pound Cooper bombs and destroying an entire arms factory and railway junction and all this sort of thing, it's a bit ridiculous, but it's done. It's still poignant at the end, with the dogfight there. And again, the Germans are not flying historical aircraft, although occasionally you get bits used from other films. The British have got, occasionally they have Nieuports, but more often they've got post-war aircraft. But again, I think that's got to still be there as my favourite First World War flying film. For the other theatres, Lawrence of Arabia obviously comes up just as a film, and for the grandeur of it all. And again, I managed to see that in the cinema when it was re-released a few years back, and that's, it really works well. The Australian film The Light Horseman is good for its cavalry charge of Beersheba. Doesn't quite work as a film as well as it might, but it's it's worth hunting out, especially just for that scene, the way the charge is done. We'll come back to that when we do our cavalry sessions is to come. I suppose thinking you've got Shout at the Devil and stuff like that for the war in Africa, but that's again based on a novel that's not too worried about fact. But again, it's quite fun as a film, though takes a surprisingly grim turn partway through. For the Western Front, though, for the classic First World War we all imagine of mud and trenches and rats and all this sort of thing, unfortunately the cliches have rather taken over for that, and 1917 received immense praise, and I love the look of the film, and I thought the two lead performances were marvellous. The two of them going out as the messengers, they're just very good, and but none of it makes any sense. I think I've mentioned before, how do you have these people who've had to sneak through the front lines, booby-trapped German trenches, and then they come along and suddenly there's a whole load of people driving trucks that are moving on. The idea that you have these two battalions, it's not even a full brigade, that are going to attack without artillery support, without any connection, and you can't simply, you can't get runners up to them, or they're not on the telephone link yet, then that you can't just drop messages down. None of it makes any sense. And you have, there's a Yorkshire battalion, there's the Devons, I think, and yet you get nobody from those areas in any of these units, none of those regional accents, which at this time in the First World War, less so in the Second World War, there's a deliberate effort to mix people so you don't have the catastrophes occurring to certain communities as you'd had with, say, the PALS battalions. In the First World War, it's a little odd, everybody seems to speak estuary English, which is just a bit, but I'm glad they made it. It looks great, I can enjoy it as a film, but as history, it isn't great. That's even more true of the Netflix film, which I guess will count as a film, of All Quiet on the Western Front, that came out recently, where it makes no sense at all. This idea of them attacking on the last day without artillery support doesn't make much sense. The thing that bothered me about that, compared to the old black and white 30s one, where they develop the characters, and you get, yes, they're all young American actors, but this group of high school kids basically who go off, enlist with enthusiasm, and then are whittled down one after another by the war. You don't get that. You don't really get much personality. I mean, perhaps it's my sensitivity because I wear the things. There's the one of the friends wears glasses, and that seems to be only significant. He gets almost no personality. It's just that they discover his battered glasses and realise he's been killed. They find them in the mud at the bottom of a trench. Again, all the cliches. It's always muddy. It's always dirty. Scarily though, it's odd because they put in a lot of effort to making those mock-ups of French tanks. Some of the gear, some of the uniforms, some of the equipment, the flamethrowers and things, was quite well done. That then they come along and on the set you have this trench which is dead straight, just going on for hundreds of miles and not zigzagging. So that, as soon as you're into that, not only is any shell that lands going to spread like blazes along that, but also once they capture one bit, they've got the whole thing. So the whole thing just felt as if they didn't really know much about the First World War. They got the superficial stuff and the look, but it was all the cliches. And then that whole business of apart from the wolf cub bit I didn't get, or fox cubs or whatever it is, but the foraging and stealing chickens and things, it just doesn't. And then mixing it with the negotiations, where I noticed there seemed to be just French people involved, that the British and okay, the French were leading then, Foch was, but it was just a bit odd. That for me I found deeply disappointing. And the historical inaccuracies in it are so big, perhaps because it's easier to spot them. But I just didn't feel it worked as a film because I didn't care enough about the characters, which you should do. And the old 30s one is much better in that respect. It's very contrived, but it's more powerful. So maybe that's got to be the sort of war on land in Europe. I mean, there's the trench, whatever, about the first day of the Somme. All right, a bit bit contrived. You've got Daniel Craig there before he was James Bond, and it just ends at the thing. Gallipoli, I suppose, again, it's not Western Front. Very powerful film. I would have liked more at Gallipoli itself than before, but it's well done. And of course, the attack on the neck there of the light horse. That's actually, it looks ridiculously close, and the Turks are sitting up there and just mowing them down. But that's pretty much what happened. So, gets a mention, but I think that's about as far as we can go. So I'm not sure I've got a clear for the War on Land favourite. So maybe we come back to Lawrence of Arabia or something as the best First World War film, even though it's about a very different aspect of the First World War. I believe there's going to be a television series coming out. I don't know what that'll be like about Lawrence. But it's interesting, and it does try to suggest complexity about the man, who was clearly an unusual individual. Though again, I remember coming across his book on Crusader castles in the Ashmolean Library at Oxford. He wrote, used to do research for that before the First War. It's a pretty good book, for its time. So let's move on. We won't really worry too much about Between the Wars. I think we'll go to the Second World War and then we'll finish there, because it's not quite like 1066 and all that, where history comes to a stop. It's you're getting to the point where it's feeling less like history, even though I suppose Korean War, Vietnam War, all this sort of thing is now quite a long way in the past. But we'll finish with the Second World War. We won't do too much on this because obviously there's a vast number of film treatments of it. I'll just talk about a few that I have a particular fondness for. I like there's some sense of historical accuracy in them. So I'm probably going more for older films because they're the ones that had a big influence on me when I was growing up. I saw it helped me to get excited about history and want to read more. We'll do something. I'll do a separate video. I'd like to do one on depiction of tank warfare in the Second World War, because I wrote about that for Hill 112, and I think that's quite interesting. So we'll do that another way. So that's where we'll get to talk about Kelly's Heroes, which I just love as a film and always cheers me up and always amuses me, but also has got some nice kit in it. For a film of its time, it had proper, if a slightly weird, mark of Sherman tank, but lots of them, and lots of other American gear that's there. But it had T-34s mocked up as Tigers that were pretty good, compared to just, you get some post-war tank and paint a big cross on it and that'll do, like the Battle of the Bulge and this sort of thing. It's this, they made an effort, it looked pretty good, and the uniform, there's a lot of details, even though it's quite light-hearted in many respects. So anyway, that's another one. Saving Private Ryan's obviously a powerful film. I think the Omaha sequences are extraordinary, and very, very powerful each time you watch them. It doesn't tell the story in the same way as The Longest Day, but then it's not supposed to. I find sometimes it drags a bit in the middle now, and the plot does seem very contrived, and this is something that bothers me with a lot of historical films. I can cope with so much, but when the plot doesn't make sense, as it doesn't with, say, 1917, or Quite on the Western Front, the recent one, and some others, it lowers the tone of the film. Saving Private Ryan is still a film I will watch regularly. And the look of it is great. I wish it wasn't so faded. At least now I've got the 4K edition. The colours look a bit better in that, because some of the fading, when it got onto DVD, it just became where all the blood was a sort of strange orange colour. It looked odd, and everything looked so muted. Again, I wish they hadn't done that. I wish they'd just filmed it straight as colour to look as it was, because that's what people would have seen at the time. I can understand the sense if you wanted to look like newsreel footage. The battle at the end is spectacular, makes no tactical sense whatsoever, and some of the other bits, where they attack that German radar station. Okay, I know it's supposed to have Tom Hanks' nerve going and he's breaking down, but it does seem, for this small group that sent out the specific mission, why they're doing this just seems, and that everybody dies. Nobody gets wounded and survives until the very end. They all die. But it's still a very powerful film. It's got to be up there as amongst the favourites. I don't think it'll quite make it to my favourite spot because I've got these reservations about it. But it's still, I'm so glad they made it, and that it led to Band of Brothers, and there being more chance of being Second World War films made, and quite a few war films made in its anyway. Oh, one I forgot for the First World War. Again, does this count? But the HBO Lost Battalion is quite good. I mean, again, it's stylized. It's, you know, but it's got its moments for a Western Front film. And I suppose before that, if we go back, the one, The Crossing, about the Trenton, I rather like as a film, but again, I don't think that ever got a cinema release, so I suppose I don't know whether I can count this today. But going back to our 18th century bit and a better treatment of the Revolutionary War. So anyway, back to the Second War. So Saving Private Ryan, definitely an honourable mention. For the War at Sea, Greyhound, Tom Hanks' film again, so he's cropping up again. He started to rival Charlton Heston and people like that are in it. Wonderful film. I think it's very well good. It's based on the novel and it sticks pretty close to the novel in many respects. It looks good. It's well done. Annoyingly, it's only on Apple, and who knows whether it'll ever get a disc release. But I watched it several times whilst I had my Apple subscription. If ever I get it again, I dare say I'll watch that straight away. I think it's pipped to the post for the top film of the War at Sea by The Cruel Sea, the 50s British film. And if you're not familiar with it, give it a go. It's one of those 50s films, particularly the sort of British ones from that era, that look really authentic. Appointment in London, Dam Busters, that sort of thing are marvellous for that. Sea of Sand, that's a fabulous film. They look right, even if there are liberties with some of the equipment and this sort of thing. But they're very good. They're very plausible. The people wear the uniform well because they'd either been in the forces or they'd seen people who have. Battleground, it's called, from the late 40s, the American film about glider-borne infantry in Bastogne. Same thing, it just looks right, even though some of it's obviously staged and studio shot. The way the cast behaves, the way they talk, it's a marvellous film. So The Cruel Sea has that, and it's got its grim moments, and it's Jack Hawkins and like that. It's a fabulous film, and again, one I can watch often. So I think that's my favourite War at Sea film, even though, again, gosh, Charlton Heston's back again. I quite like the Midway one. Tora is good, but of course it's like anything building up to that. You're dealing with a disaster. It's a little bit harder to cope with. The recent Midway film I enjoyed more than many people seem to have done. It was a bit too crowded in the air with the CGI, and aircraft were getting shot down sort of with a couple of hits and boom, gone, rather too easily, and too many of them. On the other hand, it still looked pretty good. It didn't look too obviously CGI than the fact there were too many aircraft often on screen. I quite liked that, so I enjoyed it. Saw it in the cinema. So that's a sort of sea and an air film. So those are interesting. You've got all the prisoner of war films. I watched The Great Escape a night or two ago, just as a sit down, relax. I was tired after doing all the Christmas meal and all the Christmas preparations, all this thing. I had a little bit of time to myself, and it's the sort of thing again that in Britain they'd always show on bank holidays and this sort of thing. And I thought, I'll watch this. Forgotten. It's a marvellous film. There is some basis, there's a basis of historical reality, but a lot of it's exaggerated. And you have people, like I remember seeing an interview with Donald Pleasance, who's in the film as the forger, who'd actually been a POW, been RAF and aircrew and shot down. And he said he wouldn't mouth off to the guards in that way because they're going to respond, and you didn't behave. And obviously people, Steve McQueen driving around on a motorbike, it's great cinema, but you weren't going to be doing that and all this sort of thing. But nevertheless, it's memorable. Bridge on the River Kwai, again, the story becomes less and less plausible. It goes on and doesn't reflect the reality, but there's some wonderful scenes in it. And it's a great piece of cinema. Right, we just lost a bit of that as I think I'm getting memory problems with the camera. So I nearly need to wind up this video anyway because it's gone on far longer than I planned it to be. But anyway, it's that time of year, it's holiday, it's bank holidays, it's Christmas, it's New Year. Let's just relax and talk about films. So I think we're going for two that are my favourites. One, an air war film, and then there are things like the Dam Busters, 12 O'Clock High, that are marvellous. I've got to go for the Battle of Britain, which I've mentioned before in other videos, just because I don't think we'll ever get so many period planes involved in the filming of a motion picture, and even though, okay, yeah, a lot of the Spitfires are the wrong mark, they didn't have enough Hurricanes, the 109s and the Heinkels are not quite the German models they have, Rolls-Royce engines in, they're the Spanish version, but nevertheless, when you've got about 20 bombers, twin-engine bombers in some of the scenes, you've got similar number of fighters, 109s, you've got Spitfires, you've got a few Hurricanes now and again, and yes, it's fictionalized, exaggerated, simplified, but the basis of the story and the way it works is extremely good. It does try and present it from both sides. It's really dramatic. The other thing is, again, this is why it's a personal thing for me. The first film I ever saw in the cinema was Dumbo, and that had been re-released, and my father took us, my brother and I, to see it. And in those days, this was early 70s, I suppose. I'm not quite sure how old I was probably 5 or 6, so 74, 75, something like that. I mean, we stayed around and watched it twice, and I found it heavy going, but I loved the bit where Dumbo flew around shooting peanuts like a machine gun. So we watched it twice in the day. We sat round and watched it again, and you could basically, you bought your ticket and you sat in your seat, and if you didn't leave, you could stay for the next performance. I think that's how it. I don't know whether my father had gone out and bought another ticket, but that's how I remember it. I know we saw it twice. The second film I ever saw, I think in the same cinema, they had re-released The Battle of Britain. So a couple of years after this, I got to see this film, and I remember the sheer spectacle of it. And I'm told I was able, because we were like this, sitting just watching, enthralled, and as all these dogfights were going on, these aircraft whizzing around, all the Airfix models and others that I revel in, others that I spent so much of my time making and painting and sticking on the decals, they'd all come to life wonderfully, and it was excitement and explosions and all this sort of thing. I remember being horrified but intrigued by the bit where the German gunner in the Heinkel gets shot in the eyes, apparently, and even though you look at it now, you can see very clearly they've just sprayed tomato ketchup over his goggles. It was very powerful, and it sticks in the mind. So I think that's got to rate very highly because of the aircraft, because of as I say, the basics of the story aren't bad. Yes, it's simplified. Yes, there's mostly fictional characters apart from the senior ones. But it's done. There's limited, you don't see all the Hurricanes that you should. You don't see Dorniers and 110s and Ju-88s. But, you've got the Stukas in it. That scene's very powerful, this sort of thing. And yes, there are the anachronisms, obviously the infamous doorbell and the hairstyles that are very clearly late 60s. I think it's 69 or something like that. So having got to see that on the big screen, and again we sat through and saw it twice because I was my brother as well, we just loved it so much. It was absolutely marvellous that it's still, decades later, it's stuck in my mind, and it is a film that I will probably watch every year. I'll just sit down, and it's fabulous, even though I almost know it line by line, that sort of thing. I still feel sorry for the two little boys, where the father brings them the models of Spitfires he made, and the younger brother, and I was a younger brother, gets just a smaller one. It doesn't seem fair that he doesn't get the same as the big brother. So that's going to be there as my favourite pick of the sort of the war in the air. And there's again, remember, this is the Second World War. There have been so many films made about this, about what it was like to be occupied, let alone the Holocaust and all this sort of thing. Schindler's List, very powerful film, all that sort of thing. But just for favourites, things I can go and watch again and again, and some of those are just too harrowing to watch again and again. There are many more I could mention. But we'll round off with another one that's a land war film, and for all the many that I've enjoyed and liked about different aspects of the Second World War, I'll go with A Bridge Too Far. Again, the personal element, this was on when I was at school, and I think it's now a 15 certificate over here in Britain, but I was younger than that when I went to see it, and I can't quite remember which order it came in, but I think either our father took us, the two boys, to go and see it in the cinema one night, and then either the next night or certainly the same week, we'd enjoyed it so much and were so excited that he didn't want to see it a second time. Our mother took us to see it then. So again, saw it I think consecutive days, but nevertheless saw it through twice, and the spectacle of it all on the big screen, the explosions, the noise, all the tanks, it still stands up very well as the column for 30 Corps and the Guards Armoured when they're advancing. It looks like a lot of vehicles. Yes, I know some of them are mock-ups, and that the proportion of Shermans is wrong. You haven't got any ordinary 75mm ones and this sort of thing, and that the Germans have all sorts of things just painted panzer grey and sort of covered in symbols and all that sort of thing. So you've got leopards masquerading as, I'm not sure what they're supposed to be. Are they supposed to be panthers or whatever, as German armour and similar, all sort of post-war stuff, with a few conversions to look reasonably close to some of the armoured cars, half-tracks, that sort of thing. And obviously lots of Kugelwagens and all that sort of thing. But even the scene when 30 Corps has their briefing beforehand with Horrocks, and the rows and rows of jeeps lined up outside. And again, this is all before modern CGI and all this sort of stuff. It has an epic scale about it that I like, and story-wise, there are a lot of liberties. A lot is simplified, but nevertheless, for trying to show a complex operation like that and give you an idea of what's going on with the 101st, the 82nd Airborne, 1st Airborne Division, the British, and then later the Poles at Arnhem, it's not bad. The essence is there of the history, and you can argue about how they place the blame, how they present the roles of different people, but it's not a perfect film by any means, and the way it's weighted, in part because of the story, is that most of the big set pieces come earlier on, and the last half hour or so there's less to do. You have the Poles trying to cross the river and getting shot up, which is quite grim, but there aren't the spectacles compared to the scene of the landing. And I remember as we were coming out of the cinema, my father saying he'd done his training, got his parachute wings in, I'm not sure if it was late 44 or early 45, probably early 45, so had jumped in the gear of that time. The bits they have where they've clearly attached a camera to somebody, a stuntman who's come out of the aircraft, and the noise, the sense of your wind being knocked out of you, and then the ground approaching and coming up quickly. All of that, he said, brought back lots of memories and felt very familiar. So it's got grand scenes like that. The landings are really well done, and the takeoff, and they only had 5 Dakotas, I think, in there, but it looks good the way it was done. The advance of 30 Corps, the ambush of Michael Caine and his lads. Again, stylized. There's somebody swinging a Bren gun around like blazes and that sort of thing. And there's lots, but it's just explode. But it does look good. And it's by movie standards, it's impressive. The vehicles are close enough that you can live with it. It's got that. It's got the Grabner attack, the 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion attacking over Arnhem Bridge against bits of 2nd Battalion under John Frost and all the others. Right, Gussie's just trying to go out. Okay, Gussie, there you go. You've had enough, have you? That's marvellously done. That's really impressive. Some of the fighting around Arnhem, the big assault in the dinghies, or the little the little folding boats by Robert Redford's lot going across, and then the Shermans coming and taking across, and Hardy Kruger giving the order for it to be the bridge to be blown up, but it fails and all that. So it's wonderful cinema. And having been to Nijmegen and looked at the river there, you have to, it still seems incredible that attack went in and succeeded. So it's got these great set pieces that, as I say, the really big ones come sort of earlier on, and the end doesn't quite, just from a narrative point of view. And yes, as I say, there are flaws with it. There are liberties taken with the history. There are things that clearly annoy lots of people, but it's a film I can pretty much watch every year and come back to and enjoy it each time. So that, I think, will stand as we'll round off with that. That's my favourite land-based Second World War film. There were so many more we could have talked about. Lots of other good ones out there, and there are others in different periods of history, and we could go back. I haven't mentioned things like A Lion in Winter, Man for All Seasons, films like that, because I've tended to go for the more action-based, military-based ones. There's lots of memorable stuff out there. There's great stuff, and I think it's one of those things where add in the comments your own favourites and your own, and also disagree with me as to ones that I like. But it is very much a personal thing, and there will be something that just works for me or doesn't work for me that you know, and others will just be scratching their heads as they can't understand either that I don't like something that they love, or that I like something that they think is absolute you know, nonsense and garbage and as dull as anything. So that's it. This has turned into a far longer video than I intended. I thought, you know, it might be about 40 minutes, and here we are at 2 hours or so. So sorry about that. But again, hopefully it's lighthearted. It's made people think. Maybe there's a few that people haven't seen for a while, and they'll think, oh yeah, let's dig that one out, or let's see if I can find that and watch it. Maybe there are some where you haven't come across them before, because you've just, you know, there were some that I've only stumbled across at various times. So, and lots of others. Some just food for thought. Maybe if it's just a question of you thinking, sitting down and thinking, okay, what would be my top historical film for each period, or my top 5, or my top 10, or something like that. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of good ones. I think I'll be kicking myself for ones I've forgotten to mention during this. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.